Hi, everybody. I'm Judy Clem. Nice to see you all this evening. Thanks for joining us. And on behalf of the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory, we are excited to welcome you here for our final Learn and Grow lecture. It's on pest management for veggies. It's a topic we haven't explored before, so I'm really looking forward to our speaker this evening. And as part of our mission, we want to help educate and inspire gardeners to become more confident in their endeavors. So the Learn and Grow series is a great example of that. It's 3 weeks as we lead into our annual plant sale, and we cover different topics to help you prepare your garden or we did container gardening last week with Patty Staley, and tonight we've got Ken Johnson joining us to talk about how to care for our plants so that they're as healthy as they can be once we get them planted. All of our lectures are recorded and they are available on our website. So if you missed one, please do go back and take a look at it. And you may know, if you've received any emails from us, that our 35th annual plant sale is now open. And we have a wonderful selection of edibles and ornamentals, many new featured plants this year. And you can find out more about our plant sale on our website. Also, I want to mention that our plant and tool exchange is coming up on May 19th. And that's important for you to pencil in because we're also accepting your pots returned. And if you bought plants at the plant sale, you can bring those pots back and we will wash and sterilize them and reuse them for the future. So our pot return is very popular. We usually do this in May and then again in September. So pencil that one in. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our special guest this evening. Ken Johnson is horticulture educator serving in Calhoun, Cass, Greene, Morgan, and Scott counties. His educational efforts focus on fruit and vegetable production, pest management, and beneficial insects. Through his programming efforts, he aims to increase backyard food production and foster a greater appreciation of insects. He is one of the authors of the Good Growing blog and one of the Good Growing blog hosts. I also want to introduce Casey Nikoloff. She's our co-host this evening, and she will manage our chat and Q&A at the end. And as I mentioned, if there's a small enough group, we'll just unmute and ask our questions directly to Ken. So I'll let you know how we're going to handle that as we get to the end. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Ken. And you can go ahead and share your screen. And we'll go.
All right. Seeing it all right?
Yes, looks great.
All right. So good evening, everybody. As like mentioned, we're going to talk about pest management in our vegetable gardens. Okay. So to kind of start off here, probably should define what a pest is. So a pest is just an organism that is seen as harmful or annoying. They could affect humans, animals, environment, or property. So in our case, they're going to be affecting our vegetable crops. And depending on the individual, something may be a pest or it may not be a pest. So it's a little bit of a subjective thing. So we've got things like common mallow. This is a common lawn weed that we can find in gardens as well. Japanese beetles. I'm not aware of anybody that likes having Japanese beetles around. Most people would consider this a pest. Anthracnose is a foliar disease. We get in a lot of different types of not only vegetables, but ornamental plants as well. Then we have things like squirrels. Some people actively try to attract them to their landscapes by providing them food. Other people don't want to see a single squirrel. If they're getting into your vegetable garden, you probably don't want to see them either. So it could depend on the person or on where they're at in your landscape. Same thing with deer. Some people like them to try to attract them to their landscapes. Other people are not so happy when they're going through eating their hostas or their lettuce or other plants in their landscapes. Then we have things like birds. Again, a lot of people actively feed birds, try to attract them to their landscapes. But when they're getting into your garden, eating your tomatoes or something like that, usually we're not particularly excited about that. So again, it depends on the individual or the situation. We also have, diseases. So what is a disease? So kind of the textbook definition for this is a condition in which a plant differs from a normal or healthy plant. This could be discoloration. It could be leaf spots. There's a variety of different symptoms that a plant can have that could be caused by a disease. Diseases tend to occur over a period of time. is another kind of defining characteristic a lot of times. And we can have two different types of disease. We've got our non-infectious disease, or these are going to be non-living or abiotic causes. And these cannot be transmitted. So you can't have one plant affected by it and it's not going to spread it to another plant. So this could be things like drought, flooding, some other kind of environmental stress, too hot, too cold, nutrient deficiencies, so on and so forth. So if we want to think of an example in humans, it could be a sunburn. If I get a sunburn, I cannot give that to somebody else. Another type of disease we can have are infectious, and these are caused by living or biotic organisms, and these can be transmitted from plant to plant or throughout the environment. So we have things like verticillium wilt, early blight, anthracnose, other leaf spots, things like that. So again, example in humans would be something like chickenpox, common cold, COVID, things like that. Those are living organisms that we can spread from individual to an individual, and they can reproduce and propagate themselves. So there's a variety of different things that can cause infectious diseases. So vast majority of diseases are going to be caused by fungus. More than likely, if you've got a disease in your vegetable garden, it's going to be caused by a fungus. But there are some other things, the oomycetes, these are fungal-like organisms, a lot of times called water molds. They can cause a lot of the wilt diseases because they're living in the soil. We have things like bacteria. There's some bacterial diseases we see every once in a while in tomatoes, but typically not going to be a problem. Nematodes can cause problems. In Illinois, they're not too big of a concern. They're more of a southern problem. Southern US, when we're talking about vegetable gardens anyway. And viruses and phytoplasmas, again, can occasionally cause disease, but typically not too big of a problem. Now, a lot of times diseases are going to be spread in the environment by something called vectors. So these are the living organisms, and these could be insects, mites, birds, us as humans, or organisms that are going to be able to carry these pathogens throughout the environment and spread them around. Some other people will expand this definition to include things like wind, water, tools. Pathogens can be in soil, they can be on seeds, things like that. So there's basically things that are capable of moving those diseases around in the environment. And sometimes for disease management, vector control is going to be important depending on the type of disease. So in order for diseases to develop in our landscapes, we have to have several different things present at the same time. So first off, we have to have a virulent pathogen or a pathogen that's capable of infecting plants. We have to have a susceptible host. So we have to have a species or cultivar that is capable of being infected by that pathogen. And then we have to have favorable environmental conditions. A lot of times diseases need certain conditions in order to be able to infect plants. A lot of times that's going to be moisture. They need moisture on leaves or something like that, high humidity, so on and so forth, in order for them to be able to infect plants. Sometimes temperature can be important too. One thing that's often overlooked is time. So all of these things need to come together at the same time for the right amount of time in order for disease to develop. So, we're talking about vegetables, but a good example of this would be like black spot on rose. Those leaves on the rose plants need to have moisture on them for at least 7 hours in order for that pathogen to be able to get into the rose plant and cause that infection. So that's one of the reasons why when we're growing roses, we're going to grow those kind of on the east side of the building so they get that early morning sun, burn off that moisture, help reduce the chances of those plants becoming infected. So a lot of times all of these things have to come together for a certain period of time in order for infection to happen. So when it comes to managing pests, whether those be insects, diseases, weeds, what have you, we want to try to use IPM or integrated pest management. And this is going to be a comprehensive approach to controlling these pests with both environmentally and economically sound practices. So in the case of IPM, particularly for things like insects, we have this population of insects that may be causing damage. We're going to use different IPM techniques to get these pests down to a level where they are not causing noticeable damage or they're not causing significant damage to our plants. We're not necessarily completely eliminating them from the landscape, because when we do that, a lot of times we are getting away from those economically or environmentally sound practices. So sometimes we may have low levels of these pests, but they're not causing noticeable or significant damage to our plants. So a lot of times IPM, the way I learned it, and I think it's a good way of looking at it, is think of IPM as a structure. So any good structure has a good foundation. If you don't have a good foundation, that building, that structure is not going to stick around long term. So we have to have a good foundation when it comes to pest management. So know what problems are going to be out there. So familiarize yourself with your plants. What are the growing requirements? Most of our vegetables are going to need full sun. Some of them can't tolerate a little bit of shade, but for the most part, especially if they're producing any kind of fruit, tomatoes, peppers, things like that, they need to have full sun. What's the life cycle? How long do they need to be growing? What kind of temperatures do they need? I know we've had down here in Jacksonville, it's been in the mid 80s the last few days. All of the box stores and things like that have tomatoes out. If you're buying those and putting those outside, it's going to be getting down into the 30s here later this week, and that's not good for tomato plants. So, keeping things like that in mind. If you're growing particular vegetables, have a little bit of idea of what are the common pests and diseases are, so you know what to look for or be on the lookout for as potential problems. And if you know these diseases and these pests, try to familiarize yourself with where they attack on the plant, when they typically show up, what kind of symptoms they cause, what kind of damage they cause on plants. So you know what you're looking for when you're looking at your plants. Probably the most important thing we're going to be doing in pest management is going to be scouting, and this is something that's overlooked. A lot of people don't necessarily go out and scout in their plants or in their landscapes, but ideally we're going to go out at least once a week. Ideally more often than that, but at least once a week, go out into your vegetable garden and look at your plants. What are they looking like? Are you seeing any problems? Is anything abnormal? Does it warrant a closer inspection? So we can do visual inspection. So going out, looking at plants, flipping over leaves, looking for insects or looking for leaf spots, things like that. And if we do see anything out of the ordinary, then we want to try to look and see what is causing the problem. So here we've got two pictures. We've got both of these plants have holes in their leaves. But on the left, that's cabbage worm damage on our brassica there on the cabbage. This is something we want to manage. You're not going to have a very usable product if you're having all these holes eaten in it. On the right, again, this is an ornamental plant, but this is leaf cutter bee damage. This is not something we'd want to try to manage because we'd be eliminating pollinators and stuff. So just because you see damage, you need to figure out what's causing it and is it worthwhile doing something about it. Maybe insignificant amount of damage where you don't need to really worry about it. Another example here. So here we've got some cucurbits here. We have similar symptoms here. The leaves are curling up. They're turning black. On the left, we have frost damage. So this could have been a plant that got put out too early, or they could have had an early frost cause damage to those leaves. There's nothing we can do about frost damage. This is an abiotic issue. You can spray all you want, but it's not going to do any good. On the right-hand side, we have downy mildew. This is a fungus that's causing a disease, causing these symptoms. And this is something we can do something about. So we would need to start spraying or potentially pull these plants out of our garden so it doesn't spread to other plants. So when it comes to diagnosing plant problems, so again, identifying the plants. So know what your vegetables you're growing are supposed to look like. Sometimes with tomatoes, there are some cultivars that are potato leaves, so the leaves don't look like what we typically think of as a tomato. That may throw some people off. So if you know what your plant's supposed to look like, that makes it easier to identify when any problems show up. If you do see problems, you want to inspect the entire plant. Sometimes you may be having issues with like the leaves wilting. That could likely be something going on with the roots. So inspecting the whole plant to see if you can narrow down where that problem is actually coming from. Inspect the site, examine the surroundings. You could have caterpillars like cutworms, something like that, coming in, cutting down your plants. They're not going to be in the area. They're going to move away. So you may need to look around for those a little bit. Looking for patterns, are multiple species affected or is there only one type of plant being affected? That can help you narrow down what the potential problem is. Could be an abiotic issue, could be droughts, herbicide drift, something like that. If it's all kinds of different species are being affected. What's the plant management history? Is it a drought? Have you been watering? That could be a problem. If you had too much water and you've got standing water in your garden, too much water causes just as many problems as not enough. Put all that stuff together, consult your references, whether that be reputable sites on the internet, your local extension office, something like that, if you need help figuring out what's causing your problems. So that's kind of in a kind of a real nutshell, what our foundation is. So knowing what our plants are supposed to look like, being able to identify things that don't look normal, and then trying to figure out what are causing those abnormalities in our plants. So with that information, then we can then start using our different management techniques for our pest management program. We're going to use 4 different strategies in an IPM program. So we've got our cultural, our physical, our biological, and our chemical control methods. And we'll talk about each of these individually. So for cultural, this is maintaining plant health. So this is getting into the right plant at the right place at the right time. So again, making sure you have proper sun exposure, proper soil pH, putting those plants out at the proper time of the year. Don't put your warm season plants out too early, because if we get cold soils or it gets cold, those plants will just sit there. They're not going to grow, or they can be damaged, potentially killed. Proper fertility, so soil testing every couple of years to see if you need to add any fertility to your soils. Looking at resistant cultivars for diseases and stuff that can help reduce a lot of problems right off the bat if you're getting resistant cultivars, particularly if you have problems with specific diseases year after year. That may be something you want to look at. Practicing crop rotation so you don't have buildup of pathogens and pests in the soil and stuff. That proper plant spacing help airflow get through there so we don't have a lot of humidity, which can help increase disease problems. Pruning, things like tomatoes, you can prune off those bottom leaves to help prevent the leaf spots moving up on tomato plants, for an example. Good sanitation, removing diseased plant material so it's not spreading to other plants nearby. Mulching can help conserve soil moisture, keep down weeds and things like that. Again, that water use, water when you have a drought. Don't water when we're getting plenty of rain. So for crop rotation, if we grow the same plant or same same family of plant in the same spot every year, this can encourage the buildup of diseases. A lot of times these diseases will overwinter on plant debris that's left in the garden. So we can group our plants kind of solanaceous, which would be things like peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes. Those are all related to one another. They share a lot of the same diseases and pests. Brassicas would be our cole crops, cauliflower, cabbage, broccoli, kale, kohlrabi, all of those. Legumes, peas, beans, cucurbits would be our cucumbers, our different squashes, melons, and pumpkins. Again, these different groups, they share the same diseases and pests. So ideally, we're rotating that around our garden, not growing that stuff in the same spot every year. I realize in residential areas, that's easier said than done. You have limited amount of space to grow vegetables and stuff. But try to get those plants as far away as possible from where you grew them the previous year, or potentially look at taking a year off if you have a lot of pest and disease problems with a particular group of plants. Take a year off, try to break that cycle, and then come back at it the next year. Susceptibility to disease, so looking for resistant cultivars. So plants are going to vary in their susceptibility to diseases. Certain cultivars of different plants may have different resistance to different diseases. Tomatoes are a good example. There's a lot of different diseases that tomatoes get, and different cultivars are going to have resistance or are going to be more susceptible to different diseases depending on the cultivar. So if you have a susceptible type, if that pathogen in the proper environment is around, more than likely you're going to have disease development. Tolerant plants, they're going to get infected, but they can withstand that injury a little bit better. But you're still probably going to lose some yield on those plants. Resistant, they can get infected, but it's much more difficult. You have to have really good conditions. Usually a lot of times the plants are stressed, kind of weakened when that disease develops. It's not a guarantee you're not going to get the disease, but you're much less likely to get a particular disease if a plant is resistant to it. So that's one of the reasons why we want to look at resistant cultivars of plants. Next, we've got our physical or mechanical management tools here. So we're trying to physically eliminate pests from our plants. So this could be things like cultivating for weeds, or if you've got things like hornworms or squash vine borer, those will pupate and overwinter in the soil. You can till up the soil to destroy those pupa and help reduce those populations in your garden. You can handpick things, so caterpillar, Japanese beetles, things like that. Potentially pruning, again, like those diseased plant material, you can prune that out of there. Just make sure those plants are dry. If it's wet and you start pruning, you can spread the disease. That way you can become a vector yourself. Hand pulling weeds. is a good way to control a lot of our weeds. Again, removing diseased plants, getting physically removing those plants from the landscape so it's not spreading. And you can put up barriers, floating row covers to keep insects off of plants. Things like our brassicas, cabbage, broccoli, all of that. A lot of those caterpillars that we get on there, if we put a row cover on there, those butterflies or moths can't lay eggs on there, and we eliminate those from our plants. We can do the same thing for like cucurbits, but with those need to be pollinated, so we do have to remove that row cover. So it's a temporary thing, but you can get your plants off to a good start without being attacked by insects. Then we have our biological. So with biological control, we're managing pests with natural enemies, and this could be things like predators. So top picture there, we have mites. So the mite on the right is a predatory mite. Next to that is a two-spotted spider mite, which is a common mite pest in both vegetables and ornamentals. So there are predatory mites that will eat other mites, eggs, things like that. On the bottom right, we have lady beetles. Both the adults and the larvae will feed on small, soft-bodied insects, aphids. There are some that are kind of specialized on mealybugs as well. There's several different species of ladybugs out there. And then next to that on the left, we have our aphid lions. These are larvae of lacewings. And again, they're feeding on small, soft-bodied insects like aphids in this picture. We have parasites and parasitoids. So the top picture there, this is a parasitoid wasp. And so these are not the big yellow jackets or things like that. These are small, like the size of a gnat. This particular one is laying an egg inside of an aphid. That wasp egg will hatch. The larvae will eat the inside of the aphid. Eventually, it'll emerge from that aphid, cut a hole in it, and come out, kind of like the movie Alien. Bottom right, all those white things, those are the cocoons of wasps that have eaten the inside of that particular caterpillar. So they will emerge from that and go out and attack other caterpillars and stuff. And then on the left, all those little white things, those are nematodes. They have attacked and killed that pupa of that butterfly or that moth, and then they will go out into the soil and attack other insects that are in the soil. We also have pathogens. So just like plants and humans, there are pathogens that will affect insects as well. So for this particular one, that white stuff is a fungus that has infected that caterpillar and killed it. So there are some things we can do in our landscapes, try to conserve pollinators or conserve natural enemies and also encourage pollinators to come. Again, our fruiting vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, things like that or squash or all of our cucurbits, they need pollinators in order to reproduce. We want to be able to have those in our landscapes. So we want to provide pollen and nectar sources. A lot of plants that have small open-faced flowers with exposed nectaries are attractive to these natural enemies. So things in the carrot family, aster, mustard, pea, and bean families. In my garden, we have a lot of grow herbs, and if the basil or some of the mints start flowering, I just let them flower. They have these small flowers that are very attractive to a lot of these natural enemies. It does reduce the quality of those herbs, the oils that gives them their flavor, and the fragrance stuff is reduced when they flower. But I'm not a big herb person, so it doesn't really bother me too much. If you really like herbs, maybe let one plant flower, let the others, remove those flower stalks. You still keep the quality of those herbs. Now, providing shelter for these insects, brush piles, things like that. Again, just makes your landscape that much more attractive, and reducing the use of pesticides, particularly insecticides. Those are intended to kill insects. A lot of these natural enemies and pollinators are going to be insects. So we need to be smart about how we're using insecticides in our gardens if we want to have these other beneficial insects around. And then finally, we have chemicals. So we're managing our pests with pesticides, whether that be insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, what have you. So when it comes to chemicals, when we're doing an IPM, if we're using IPM in our landscapes, we're going to try to use chemicals only when needed. Sometimes pesticides will be the best option to controlling a pest, but in a lot of cases, there's other things we can do before we need to start spraying. We want to try to get away from that spray and pray approach where we see a problem and we just spray and hope that'll take care of it, or we think something might be there, or we're anticipating something coming and we just spray just in case. We want to get away from that approach. When it comes to spraying, make sure we're reading the labels and following those directions. If the label says use 3 ounces, don't use 4 ounces. More does not equal better. More can cause problems in your landscape. And if possible, you want to try to rotate chemicals. Don't use the same chemical over and over and over again. This is a little more important for more commercial use where they're using them much more frequently. But if we're constantly using the same chemicals, we do encourage the development of resistance in pest populations. I would not be a good extension employee if I did not try to scare you when it comes to pesticides and kind of being a label, the labels and stuff. The label is a legal document. They're going to say it is a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. So we need to make sure we're following the labels, following the directions, making sure that the crop we are applying these pesticides to is listed on the label. We're doing the right amounts, so on and so forth. Since we're going to be applying these to food crops, we want to make sure we pay attention to those pre-harvest intervals. So any kind of pesticide that you're going to be applying to something you're going to be eating is going to have a pre-harvest interval. So basically, after you spray, the amount of time in days usually that you have to wait before you can harvest that crop. And this can be, you could have a product that you can spray on 15 different vegetables, and each vegetable could have a different pre-harvest interval. It could be 1 day for one crop, and it could be 30 days for the other. So make sure you're reading that label and following those pre-harvest intervals if you're going to be applying pesticides to your vegetables. So when it comes to pesticides, we can categorize them in a variety of different ways. So you probably can't read this slide and you don't really need to, but this is just an example of how one of the ways we can classify pesticides based on the type of pests that they control. In our vegetable gardens, probably 4 main types we're going to use, really two probably: fungicides, if we have any fungal diseases; herbicides, you may or may not be using. A lot of times you cannot use those around food crops, but if you're establishing a new in-ground bed, you could do, you're trying to kill off turf or something, you may be using herbicides. Insecticides to kill insects and related organisms. And you may be using repellents, maybe a mosquito repellent while you're working, or if you have issues with mammals getting in. You could use repellents, but a lot of times repellents are not labeled to be used around vegetable gardens either. So you may or may not be able to use those. We can look at them as being synthetic or biorational. So synthetic pesticides are going to be man-made. Common examples, a lot of some stuff we use in gardens, maybe not organophosphates anymore, but carbamates and pyrethroids are common synthetic pesticides we're going to use in vegetable gardens. We have our biorational pesticides, which are made from natural materials. So these could be some of the microbial pesticides like BT, growth regulators, botanicals, plant extracts, things like that, or some of the soaps or horticultural oils as well. Now, just because something is biorational or something is natural does not mean it's safe. It does not mean, if it's a natural chemical, we can just go out and spray in t-shirt and shorts. We still need to take precautions when using these because they can still be toxic. So here, just some examples. You can't use these products, these natural products in your home gardens. I'm not even sure you can buy them as pesticides anymore, but in the past you could use these. And there are some very toxic natural chemicals out there. So the LD50 is the lethal dose that takes to kill 50% of a population. The smaller the number, the more toxic it is. So you can see some of these nicotine sulfate, rotenone, which are natural chemicals, are much more toxic than something like carbaryl, which is a synthetic insecticide. So again, we can't really use these anymore, but just because it's natural doesn't mean it's safe. Nature is just a giant arms race of things trying to kill each other, and it's come up with some very, very toxic chemicals. In our vegetable gardens, more than likely, we're going to be using contact pesticides. So these must come into physical contact with the pest in order to be effective. So good coverage is going to be important. If you're spraying this on a plant and you miss an entire side of the plant, there's no insecticide there in the case of insects. They're not going to be exposed to it, and it's not going to control them. So we need to make sure we're having good coverage with contact pesticides. Residual is also important, but this is kind of a double-edged sword. We want those pesticides to stick around long enough that, and again, in the case of insects, those pest insects are going to come into contact with it and be killed. But if they stick around too long, then we have to start worrying about those non-target organisms coming into contact with it, where those be natural enemies, pollinators, humans, what have you. So it's a bit of a balancing act. We want them to stick around to provide protection to our plants, but we don't want them sticking around so long that they start causing problems with other organisms. There are systemic pesticides too. Those are not terribly common in vegetable gardens because those have the potential to move in are going to be in the parts of the plant that we're eating. Those are going to be used more for ornamental settings. And then we have selectivity. So we have non-selective pesticides, so they control virtually all related pests. Example of this would be glyphosate, herbicide. It's going to do damage to pretty much any kind of plant it touches. We have selective pesticides, which control related pests but cause little or no injury to others. So 2,4-D would be an example. This is used a lot in like lawn herbicides. It doesn't affect grasses, but it does affect broadleaf weeds. So we'll kill those. So if you're somebody that treats your yard and you're trying to grow vegetable crops, you need to be careful because sometimes these can volatilize and drift onto our vegetable gardens. And a lot of our vegetables, particularly tomatoes and stuff, are very sensitive to some of these broadleaf herbicides. Another example is BT. This is a microbial pesticide. And depending on the strain, the Kerstachii strain, the BTK, this only affects caterpillars, so it does not affect other types of insects. There's the BTI, Israeliensis strain, that is used on like aquatic flies, black flies, fungus gnats, mosquito larvae, things like that. So these are fairly specific and do not harm other types of organisms. So if we're looking at using pesticides in our vegetable gardens, we want to try to look for the selective ones, particularly for insecticides. So there's kind of our IPM program there. So again, we have that good foundation, and that's going to help us use these different management techniques to manage pests in our gardens. So now we'll go through some of the more commonly encountered pests and diseases. This is not an extensive or exhaustive list. There's a lot of stuff that I just don't have time to cover everything. But these are some of the more common ones we may see in our vegetable gardens. Aphids, get these a lot in vegetable gardens. You would get them really in any kind of plant you're trying to grow. Aphids, probably a good chance they're going to be a problem. Slow moving, fairly small insects, about an eighth of an inch or less. They're kind of pear-shaped. And they have these two projections on the hind end called cornicles. That's how you would know you have an aphid that's kind of distinctive to them. Typically, we're finding them on succulent new growth. That's what they like. So on the growth points is typically where you're going to find them. When they're feeding, they can cause leaf distortion. They'll suck out plant juices. Their saliva can cause distortion of plants. And these are vectors that can transmit diseases, particularly viruses. Usually not too terribly important in vegetable plants, at least for acting as vectors. More of an issue with ornamental plants. Whiteflies is another one. See these a lot on cucurbits or tomatoes, particularly later in the season. They have these white waxy bodies. The name whiteflies. A lot of times you find them on the underside of leaves, and when plants are disturbed, they'll fly away. And if you get enough of them, it could look like it's snowing in the middle of the summer. Again, they have these piercing sucking mouth parts, just like aphids do. So they're removing plant juices, and they can cause mottling or the yellow patterns on leaves. Yellowing the leaves, they can also cause some distortion as well. When it comes to management of aphids and whiteflies, a lot of times all we have to do is a steady stream of water, get the garden hose out, spray your plants off a couple times. And a lot of times that'll knock a lot of them off. They don't necessarily make it back onto the plant. That may be all you have to do. Like I mentioned in the biological control part, there's a lot of natural enemies, lady beetles, aphid lions, parasitoid wasps that will attack these insects. So you may see a population, keep an eye on it, but you may be surprised. You may have these natural enemies moving in and taking care of that population for you. We can remove plants when we're done with them, when we're done harvesting, managing weeds. These can act as reservoirs for these insects to move in to our more desirable crops. And there are chemicals that we can use, both synthetic and natural or organic type chemicals that we can use to manage them as well, if it gets to that point. If you grow any kind of brassicas, so cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, any of that, cabbage worms can be a problem. We have 3 different types in Illinois that are causing most of the problems. Imported cabbage worm, cabbage looper, and diamondback moth. So imported cabbage worm are on the left. They're kind of green and velvety. These are butterflies. They will eventually turn into butterflies. So if you have a bunch of white butterflies flying around your plants, landing on them occasionally, it's not probably something you should be too excited about. They're probably laying eggs, and you're going to have caterpillars hatching soon. So if you see a bunch of white butterflies flying around your brassicas, probably a good indication you need to start scouting and see if you're going to have problems with cabbage worms. Cabbage looper in the middle there, green caterpillars, and they're kind of like inchworms, so they'll bunch up in the middle as they walk. They will turn into moths, so those adults are out at night. We don't typically see them. Diamondback moth is on the right. These are much smaller. They're kind of pointed at the ends, tapered at both ends. Again, is another moth. So again, they're out at night. We don't typically see those adults when they're laying eggs. And when they get onto plants, they will eat small holes in there. From a commercial perspective, you can't sell that crop at home. You're going to have a lot of holes in there. And broccoli, they can get into the heads and into the heads, and you try to wash them out. You don't get them all out, and you end up with a little extra protein when you're eating your broccoli. Hornworms, if you grow tomatoes, they can be a problem. Hornworms can also get on things like eggplants and peppers. Typically see them on tomatoes, though. We have our tomato and our tobacco hornworm. Tobacco hornworm is the one I always see. That's the one on the left with the diagonal stripes on them and the red horn. Tomato hornworm has the V shaped or the chevrons on the side and the blue horn. If you really want to tell the difference between them, that's what it is. Management's going to be the same, though. They cause the same type of damage. When they're young, they're camouflaged very well. They're hard to see. And as they get bigger, they can completely strip a plant overnight if you have a couple caterpillars, large caterpillars on a plant. This is another one, though. Sometimes we'll have natural enemies moving in. So again, those white things, those are the cocoons of wasps that have eaten the inside of that caterpillar. So if you see something like this, leave that in your landscape. That caterpillar is not going to be doing any more damage. And eventually you'll have dozens of wasps coming out of there that will go out and attack other hornworms for you. And if you do have issues with hornworms, again, they camouflage themselves. They hide during the day. They're most active at night. You can go out with a black light in your plants, and those caterpillars kind of fluoresce. Makes them much easier to see if you use a black light at night. So, little tip for you there when looking for them. As far as caterpillars go, when we're trying to manage them, so some non-chemical options is hand picking, using row covers or netting. Again, if you're doing this on a crop that has to be pollinated, you will have to remove those row covers so you can get pollination, but you can keep those plants pest-free for a period of time before you have to remove that. And then removing infested plant material after harvest. They may be overwintering on that, and maybe tilling the soil as well. Chemical, so like I mentioned, the BTK, the Bacillus thuringiensis Kerstachii, again, that only affects caterpillars. So that's a good option, a selective option. And there are other insecticides that are not quite as specific, but that will do a good job of managing them as well. Corn earworm, tomato fruitworm, same species, just depends on what type of plant it's eating as to what we call it. So caterpillars for corn, they'll get into the ears and feed on those. And tomatoes, they'll burrow into the fruit, typically cause damage to less than 5% of the crop. And I don't know about you, but towards the end of the season, I'm not too terribly upset if I lose 5% of my tomatoes, because by the time August, September rolls around, I'm usually done with tomatoes. So I don't usually get too upset if I get these in my tomatoes. For management of these, when corn begins to silk, that's when they become an issue on corn. So you want to start spraying for them then. This is one where sprays is probably going to be the best option, because once you need to prevent them from getting inside of those ears. Because once they're in there, there's not much you can do about it. Tomato and pepper, you only really need to spray for them when you have fruit on the plants. And if you notice some damage, it's probably a good idea you want to spray. Or if you're surrounded by corn, around you guys, it's probably not a big of a concern, but down here in central Illinois, we've got cornfields everywhere, so it can be more of a problem. The top there, that's what the adults are. These are moths. Again, flying at night, we're probably not going to see them. And the caterpillars can be quite variable in their appearance. A lot of different colors, lots of color variation within those caterpillars. Squash vine borer. Squash and pumpkins are going to be the most susceptible to this. So the adults will lay eggs on those vines as they start to run. The caterpillars will hatch, and they will bore in to those vines and eat the inside, and that'll cause those plants to start wilting and collapse. So again, we can do row covers until blooming starts to keep those moths off, prevent them from laying eggs. And this particular moth actually flies during the day, so you can't see these out and about in your garden. We can try doing a late planting in early July. By then, the adults are out. Those plants aren't going to be big enough for them to lay eggs on, and you can avoid it. The issue is, though, you start to run up against that frost date. So you're kind of rolling the dice there. So maybe plant some normal time and then plant later as a kind of an insurance policy. Again, doing crop rotation, don't grow that stuff in the same spot every year. They'll pupate and overwinter in the soil. Looking at tolerant varieties, things like butternut squash or more resistant to damage by these. Something like blue Hubbard, if you whisper squash vine borer to it, it starts to die. It's very susceptible to them. And then we can apply pesticides when those vines begin to run, when they start to extend. We can protect those with insecticides. Cucumber beetles, big problem on cucumbers, but also other cucurbits as well. The larvae will eat the roots, burrow into young plants, and the adults will eat the leaves on seedlings and cause damage on the stems. And on the top picture there, they can eat the fruit as well. And these can be vectors for bacterial wilt, so this can be a big problem. So again, row covers to keep them off of your plants until bloom. And then if you start seeing beetles show up, applying pesticides is probably going to be the best way to manage these. So we can try to prevent that bacterial wilt from getting into our plants. Squash bugs can be a big problem if you grow any kind of squash plants. Squash and pumpkins primarily. Cucumbers aren't really too big, injured by them too much. But they're sucking the sap out of leaves and stems. You can see that in the middle picture there, that browning, those spots, that stippling damage. For the eggs on the top there, they're kind of a brick red. A lot of times laid kind of in the crotches of those veins and stuff. So we can go out and scout for those, handpick and destroy the eggs. They'll overwinter in debris and they'll hide in debris during the day. So removing debris. I like to mulch my vegetable garden, but that is creating a good environment for squash bugs. So again, that's kind of a balance there. And once eggs start to hatch, we want to start spraying. Squash bugs in particular, but a lot of insects, the bigger they get, the more difficult they are to manage, particularly with the insecticides we can use as homeowners. So this is one you need to stay on top of it. Flea beetles, we see these in a lot of different crops. I see them primarily in like potatoes and radishes, but we can see them in eggplants and beans and spinach, a lot of other things. They'll eat these small holes. Looks like a shot hole, like somebody shot it with a shotgun. You have all these small little holes throughout the leaves. Controlling weeds, row covers are a good way to manage these. And again, pesticides if populations get too high. Japanese beetles, we get these in a lot of different types of plants here on green beans or bean leaves. They can clip silks on corn as well, so you don't get pollination, you don't get any ear fill on that. So this is, hand picking if you don't have too many, or spraying them as well. Real quick, we'll go through some of the different foliar diseases. So early blight, this is one we get a lot on tomatoes and some of the related plants. So we start getting these spots on the leaves. A lot of times we'll get kind of this target pattern on there. They get onto the fruit, we can get these leathery spots on them. It can cause the fruit to drop prematurely from the plant. Septoria leaf spot is another common problem we get on tomatoes. We have these dark spots. They have dark margins, tan gray centers. A lot of times you can see black pimple-like structures on there. These are the structures that are releasing the spores for this fungus. And this and early blight both, typically they start on the older leaves at the bottom and work their way up the plant as time goes on. Cercospora leaf spot, if you grow spinach or Swiss chard or beets, these are all related. This is a common disease on there. It can make them unsightly. For beets, it can reduce, the photosynthesis, so you don't get as big root production on those. Powdery mildew is a common disease. We can get it on cucurbits, we get it on peas, beans, a lot of different types of vegetable plants and ornamental plants as well. Different species have different species of powdery mildew. So if you have powdery mildew on your oak tree, that's not going to infect your squash plant. Different species of powdery mildew attack different species of plants. We get this white powdery growth on the upper and lower leaf surfaces. Those spots will grow bigger. They can coalesce and cover the entire leaf surface, which again reduces photosynthesis, kills the leaves, reduces production, and can potentially kill the plant if it's bad enough. This is one that likes high humidity, so this is usually moving a little bit later in the season. But this is one of the few diseases where rainfall is actually bad for it. It likes it when it's really nice and hot and humid, but we're not getting a lot of rain. That's really good environment for powdery mildew. When it comes to managing foliar diseases, so again, we're looking for resistant cultivars. So if you consistently have problem with a particular foliar disease, look at getting a cultivar that's resistant to it. Good crop rotation. Most of these will overwinter in the soil on plant debris or in the soil itself. So rotating your crops so we're not having a buildup of disease. Again, good air circulation. So plants dry out faster, less favorable environment for disease development. If you're buying plants, making sure you're inspecting those so you're not bringing problems home with you. Make sure you don't have any leaf spots on those when you're purchasing them. If the foliage is wet, don't go into the garden. As you touch it, you may get spores on you, and then you'll spread those throughout your garden as well. We want to try avoid watering in the evening. If we do that, the sun goes down, that moisture sits on the leaves for a lot longer. Again, we have a more favorable environment for disease development. So water in the morning so that moisture can be burned off by the sun. And we want to try to avoid getting the foliage wet. Again, that creates good environment and can splash those spores up the plant. Mulching the soil provides a barrier. Those things are overwintering in the soil. We put mulch down, there's now a barrier. It can slow down or slow the spread of that disease from the soil up onto the plant. We can remove the lower leaves as plants get older. Again, make it more difficult for that pathogen to get from the soil onto our plants. And then fungicides are also an option for managing all of these. They're not going to get rid of the disease that's on the plants, but it will protect foliage that's not affected yet. It will protect it. It's not going to eliminate it from things that are infected, but it can't protect your healthy foliage. Some other diseases real quick. So bacterial wilt, we get this in melons and cucumbers. They can cause plants will start wilting kind of during the heat of the day. They'll recover at night. Progressively, they'll wilt longer and longer and longer until those plants just collapse and die. So if you're seeing something like this, you can check for bacterial ooze. So you can cut that vine, kind of rub it together and pull it slowly apart. And you can see in that picture there, kind of looks like snot coming out of there or sticking in water. You get that streaming, that oozing. That's an indication you have bacterial wilt. Now, so for this, if you have that, you want to remove that plant so those cucumber beetles don't pick it up and spread it to other plants in your landscape. Anthracnose, this is a disease we get on fruit, particularly like tomatoes and peppers. So we get these sunken lesions, these sunken spots on our fruits, and then you can see they'll start producing spores, turn yellow and black, maybe sometimes salmon colored. This is another one. Pull those fruit off, get them out of your landscape so that's not spreading to other fruit on your plants. Some disorders, so too cold. So again, putting out warm season crops too early can cause damage to them, or they may just sit in the ground and not grow, which opens them up to getting infected by insects and diseases as well. Too hot or cool season crops, lettuce on the right there. When it starts getting real warm, these plants will bolt, they'll start to flower. And if you've ever eaten lettuce that's getting ready to bolt, it is incredibly bad. It's very, very bitter. On the left there, that's broccoli. We're eating the flowers, the flower buds of broccoli. So again, if you let that wait too long to harvest, or if it gets warm, they'll bolt. Those flowers will open. It's not good quality anymore. Blossom end rot. Usually we talk about this in tomatoes, but peppers, squash can get this as well. A lot of people think it's a calcium deficiency, but this is actually more and more they found it's a water issue, irregular watering. So if you have nice, consistent watering, you can reduce the chances of blossom end rot. Mulching can help with that. With tomatoes, some cultivars are just more prone to it than others, particularly the larger beefsteak types. Now they have larger fruit. They're more prone to developing blossom end rot than like a cherry tomato. I've never seen a cherry tomato develop blossom end rot. Cracking. So if we get, if it's been kind of dry and then we get a heavy rain, those fruit take up a lot of water. The fruit expand too quickly. The skin can't expand with it. Then we start getting cracking. picture on the bottom there with those red tomatoes, that's pretty severe. That's an open wound. Pathogens and other insects will move into that. That's probably not good. Tomato on the left, it's still probably harvested. It's not very pretty looking, but you can still harvest and eat that. Same thing with the pepper on the right there. That's all scabbed over, and you could still pick that and eat it if you want. Poor pollination, cucurbits. We can see this a lot. If you get this deformed fruit and stuff like that, that can be an indication you have poor pollination. Those cucurbit flowers are only open for a day, so you could have may not have had a lot of pollinators around. It could have been cool and rainy when those flowers are open, so you didn't get good pollination. A variety of different factors can cause that. But if you have misformed cucumbers and stuff, a lot of times that's because of poor pollination. And then last slide here, wildlife can cause lots of problems. You have squirrels moving in, eating plants. Bottom on the left there, that's birds pecking. In this picture, a peach, but you see similar damage in tomatoes, like somebody stabbed the plant. On the right, rabbits moving in. So exclusion for things like rabbits, using fencing, habitat modification, providing alternative food sources or water sources. A lot of times when it gets really dry, that's when squirrels and stuff start moving into our vegetable garden, eating tomatoes to get the moisture. So providing water for them away from your vegetable garden could be an option, or alternative food sources. Like I mentioned, repellents. There are repellents for repelling wildlife, but a lot of them cannot be used in vegetable gardens. So repellents may not be an option. If you can find one that can be used in vegetable gardens, certainly you can, but pretty much all of them that I've ever found say do not use in vegetable gardens. I will say we got a dog during COVID, and a lot of our squirrel problems in our landscape and rabbit problems reduced pretty quickly once we got a dog. So that could be an option too, if that's feasible for you. So that's all I've got for you tonight. So we can do questions if people want. And like I mentioned, to do Good Growing blog, Good Growing podcast, if you're interested in those, you can check those out.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ken. So, folks, we've got a small enough crowd, right, Casey? Don't you think we can
I think so. Yeah.
open it up? Does anybody want to unmute? What's on your minds? What would you like to ask Ken?
Hi, I have a question. Sorry. I had it in the chat, but when you remove the bugs, I'm assuming you destroy them, or can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, do you relocate them? Do you destroy them when you pick them off? I mean, I guess people are destroying them, right?
Yeah, it would be best to destroy them. Yeah, don't pick them off and throw them on the ground. They'll just move back onto your plants. So dispatch them however you want, whether that's smushing them, put them in a bag out in the sun, cook them. Yeah, don't just throw them in the ground. On the ground, they'll move back. Yeah,
All right,
kill them in some way. Put them in. If like Japanese beetles, you can get a bucket of water, put a drop or two of soap. You don't have to make it real soapy. That soap is just to break the surface tension of the water so they sink. You can just drop them in there and they'll drown.
Okay, thank you.
So do you want to do a 2-second, 2-minute cicada?
Sure. So this year, is a big year for cicadas in Illinois. So we've got brood 13 and brood 19 showing up. Down here in central Illinois, we'll have some areas like Springfield will have both broods potentially coming out. But up by you, you guys are brood 13, so that's the 17-year cicadas. Not really concerned for vegetable gardens. The adults do feed. They may feed a little bit on a few vegetables, but it's not to any extent where they're going to cause damage to your plants. The concern with them when it comes to plants is egg laying in woody plants. So if you've got newly planted small trees and shrubs, like whips or something really small, you probably want to protect those. The egg laying will cause damage to plants. On really small stuff, it can't cause significant damage. Or if they're laying in the trunks of plants, it could kill them. Large mature trees, you don't need to worry about. You'll get some flagging. Tips of the branches may die, but trees produce more leaves than they need. They won't be harmed. This is happening for thousands of years. Healthy, well-established, mature trees will be fine. And for the cicadas, they don't bite, they don't sting, they're not poisonous, they're not venomous, so it's not something you have to worry about. They're not going to hurt you. It may get loud. If you live in an area where you got a lot of old
Yeah.
trees, it could be 90 plus decibels, which is like a motorcycle or a lawnmower if you get a high enough population. So it could potentially be rather loud depending on, what the tree situation is around you. They'll be out for probably 4 to 6 weeks, and then they'll all die. It's going to smell terrible for a while, but you won't see them again for 17 years.
So when you say protect the trees, we put in some pawpaws a couple of years ago. They were just little baby saplings. Do I wrap it in aluminum foil? Do I get some kind of netting? Like
So
what
you
would
want
be appropriate?
So netting, usually you want holes no bigger than a quarter, maybe a half an inch.
Okay.
You could look at like a floating row cover, something like that. You're going to
Okay.
put that around the trees. You want to secure that to the trunk so they can't crawl up the trunk of the tree. If it's got a big enough trunk, you just have to protect the branches and stuff. If it's a really small, like a whip tree, or maybe it's only a couple of years old, you want to secure that at the base of the tree so they can't lay eggs
Okay.
in the trunk of the plant.
Mhm. Great. Okay. Any other questions, guys?
I just want to say thank you. It's such a great topic. I mean, everybody has to deal with this, and just having an honest conversation about how it all works, what to look for, even the scouting and the looking at night, all really helpful. So I do appreciate it. Thank you so much, Ken.
You're welcome.
Great presentation, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everybody who tuned in tonight. We will send a little survey, very brief, and is an opportunity for you to share your feedback on some topics you'd like to hear in the future. We do review them as we go through our programming planning, and so any ideas or suggestions that you have, we appreciate it. And on behalf of the Friends, Ken, we thank you so much. This was fascinating and interesting. And like I said, before we got started, a topic we've never covered before. So I really think this was valuable information, and we'll be sure to share it with our community in the future, and it'll live on our website after tonight's program. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have
Thanks
a
for
good
having me.
night.